Welcome to the Wheats on Your Mind podcast. My name is Aaron Harries. Wheats on Your Mind is brought to you by the Kansas Wheat Commission and Kansas Association of Wheat Growers. On this episode of the podcast, we are visiting with Reid Christopherson. Reid was appointed to serve as the executive director of the South Dakota Wheat Commission in 2014. Prior to his appointment, he served for over 39 years as a member of the United States Air Force and the South Dakota Air National Guard, retiring as a lieutenant colonel. His service as both an enlisted member and officer placed him throughout the world. Christopherson received Bachelor of Science and Master's of Science degrees from South Dakota State University in Animal Science and was named as a distinguished alumni of South Dakota State University. Reid and his wife Ruth live on a small farm west of Garrettson, South Dakota. They have 2 children and 1 granddaughter. Well, I read this bio of yours and I think I got a lot of living to catch up to whatever you've done there. This doesn't include your work with the Boy Scouts and as a lay minister and among other things. So first of all, congratulations on your retirement. I know it hasn't been too long. Hopefully you've had a chance to enjoy it now. But man, animal science, Air Force, and wheat, how did you get to wheat going through all of that?
Well, interesting transition. My passion growing up as a child was to always try to be a farmer, but that was not in the cards for me. And so I figured the next best thing was to get into perhaps veterinary medicine. Joined the Air Force while I was still in high school to get the GI Bill to help make that dream possible. And served 4 years and then took that GI Bill and went to South Dakota State University, starting in veterinary medicine and then quickly transitioning into animal science as I learned more about some of the opportunities. So came out of there as a livestock nutritionist, worked for a regional feed company until the mid-1980s when the ag economy obviously took a serious downturn, returned back to the military until the ag economy would settle down, in my opinion. Almost 30 years later, then I found myself retiring. Looked at an ad in the local weekly newspaper for executive director of the South Dakota Wheat Commission. They were looking, I was looking. Great opportunity and probably the absolute best 10 years of my professional career.
So where did you grow up?
Grew up in Sioux Falls, South Dakota.
Okay, so you'd had a little bit of ag background and that animal science part, the vet medicine part. What did you see yourself doing? Were you on a path to become a full-time vet?
Well, I started that way and then decided that chemistry and I weren't the best friends. And so I had the opportunity at that point to have a much broader vision of just the careers that were available within agriculture. Growing up in the city, even though my grandparents, aunts and uncles farmed, probably had a limited vision of what someone could do that didn't grow up on a farm or have a farm to return to. So as I learned more about the animal science opportunities and livestock nutrition specialist, it really excited me and I loved it tremendously. Just the unfortunate timing of the ag economy at that point in the 1980s.
And tell us about your time on the Air Force.
I had a great experience. I was enlisted for 11 years and then commissioned as an officer for 28. My 11 years, I was an aircrew life support specialist. So in addition to those college degrees, I actually also have an associate degree in survival and rescue operations. So it only adds to the complexity of the bizarre nature of my career. Once I was an officer, a lot of time as an executive officer to the commander, public affairs. I was also an aircraft maintenance officer and commanded aircraft maintenance and logistics squadrons.
So, Reid, tell us the basics of kind of the South Dakota Wheat Commission. Is it a government agency? How does a checkoff work up there?
Well, we are kind of a function, kind of referred to at times as kind of quasi-government. The commission is administered by 5 commissioners that are wheat producers themselves. They are all appointed by the governor of South Dakota for 3-year terms, and if reappointed and if they desire to continue, can serve up to 12 consecutive years. They provide the vision. They certainly provide the approval for the budgets and how we move forward. They and then in turn have the authorization to hire an executive director and any support staff to administer the day-to-day factors of the commissions.
And what is the checkoff amount right now?
Our checkoff is based on value, so we're at about 0.4% of the price of the wheat. So previously, 10 years ago, we were at a penny and a half a bushel. Just as a quick comparison as how those match up, a penny and a half equals 0.4% at $3.75 a bushel. So if you're at $5 wheat, 0.4%, you'd be at 2 cents a bushel check off.
So you had that leadership background, obviously a nice transition for you into working for South Dakota Wheat. When you got on board with South Dakota Wheat, you were filling some big shoes. Tell us a little bit about your predecessor.
Well, Randy England was a tremendous, executive director of the South Dakota Wheat Commission. He served in that position for 23 years. And before him, Ben Hancock, who went on then to become the executive director of the Wheat Quality Council. And very fortunate that Ben was also a second cousin of mine. So had some tremendous mentors as I came into the position. Had some big shoes to fill, but they had also left a wonderful groundwork, and the position was in good shape. No crises to solve as I stepped in, and was really just able to continue on.
So what was the state of wheat in South Dakota 10 years ago when you started, and then talk about how it changed over the 10 years that you were in charge?
Kind of sorry to say that it was much larger than when I started, than when I left. Looking back at some of the dynamics of the changing agricultural landscape in South Dakota, over the 10 years that I was executive director, we lost 1/3 of the wheat acres in South Dakota. Over the last 20 years, we've lost half of the wheat acres. Ever-changing landscape, a lot of factors that go into that, mostly a tremendous influx of row crops of corn and soybeans, largely due to great new chemistries, wonderful genetics, varieties that were available to them, and then really the wonderful job that those organizations through their checkoffs have done in the development of value-added opportunities. So development of ethanol plants, soy crush plants, some climate shift favoring those row crops, and we've just seen those grow and take off more and more all the time.
Yeah, a lot of parallels between South Dakota and Kansas. Quite a bit of crop diversity in South Dakota also. Give us a brief refresher. I mean, it's not just spring wheat that's grown in South Dakota either.
No, we are half hard red winter wheat and half hard red spring wheat. The dividing line being right across the east-west center of the state. Had some durum years ago, but that has largely shifted to the north, and certainly North Dakota is even seeing a similar shift in that pattern. As you move into southeastern South Dakota, I often say we look more and more like Iowa all the time. It's almost nearly a total corn-soybean rotation. Moving to the west and the north, though, you will start to see some added diversity with the inclusion of spring wheat, winter wheat, oats, alfalfa, sunflowers, milo. And to a lesser extent, we're starting to see some interest in the pulse plants.
So a wheat farmer in South Dakota, are they going to be growing both winter and spring wheat?
Some are. In fact, some of the bigger expansion in spring wheat has actually been down along the Nebraska border, where it would be typically only winter wheat. They're finding some favorable conditions for getting that in, and in some cases even using some dormant seeding coming in late December, very early January, February, if the ground conditions permit to get it in there so that it is ready. Across the northern part of the state, it just seems like we're having more and more challenges with spring wheat, ever-changing conditions, and falling numbers, ergot, color, scab. It just kind of seems to be the annual challenge on what's going to plague them this year.
I suppose that begs the question then, winter hardiness issues for winter wheat. Is there quite a range in that from the southern to northern part of the state?
There is, and you won't see too much of winter wheat going north of about the center of the state. Spring wheat is spread farther to the south than winter to the north. However, we were successful here a few years ago in getting RMA to at least allow the insurance of winter wheat in northern South Dakota.
Regarding spring wheat, is there a protein range between what you can get for spring wheat in the southern part of the state versus the northern part?
Well, all of the wheat in South Dakota is sold on a protein scale. So winter wheat being, of course, that target of 12, spring wheat of 14% protein, with discounts certainly below, and occasionally a premium if we exceed that. So they are watching it, but spring wheat that might be sold in southern South, or sold or grown in southern South Dakota, certainly must meet the same standards as that in the north.
What do you think are the biggest challenges facing farmers in South Dakota right now?
Well, when we look at more and more the diversity of cropping, we are certainly seeing some shift in climate and unpredictable rainfall. Price is always going to be the big issue. Farmers would like to grow wheat. They see the merit for wheat into a rotation, but at the end of the day, that enterprise has to pay its bills. Wheat's got to carry its own.
Let's talk a little bit about market situation. So I think most of us in Kansas are familiar with most of our commodities either moving south or west. How does the flow of wheat work from South Dakota? How does it find its way out of the state, and who are your biggest export customers?
Well, we've got a challenge in moving wheat in South Dakota, and that's largely related to the Homestead Act of the 1800s and how the railroads were built as expansion moved from the eastern part of the state to the west. So the rail predominantly moves west to east, and so it originally was built to move that wheat towards Minneapolis, towards Chicago, and the domestic market. So it remains a challenge for us to get wheat out of the state and to enter either the PNW or the Gulf export region. Consequently, we probably do send most of our wheat into the domestic market. We do not have any flour mills in the state of South Dakota, so every bushel of wheat that is grown must leave the state. But I often mention the fact that even though we're probably sending our wheat into the domestic market, if Kansas doesn't have an export market for winter wheat, North Dakota doesn't have an export market for spring wheat, we're all challenged by that experience. So truly a rising tide does raise all ships, and we're as dependent upon that global export market as any other state.
Yeah, there is a transition in on-farm storage as you go from north to south. Of course, here in Kansas, we have mostly commercial storage with some on-farm storage. What's the situation in South Dakota?
Most of the significant farmers in South Dakota have a tremendous amount of on-farm storage. In fact, from a distance, you would think you were maybe even approaching a local farmer's elevator. So many of them have the ability to store for a year, multiple years if necessary. So they are watching for that market. Much of that has to do with the fact, certainly, as harvest is taking place and with the sizes of the wheat operations, there just isn't time to haul that wheat to an export terminal. So it must be stored on the farm until farming operation slows to a point to permit more trucking.
What's the message you have when companies like U.S. Wheat Associates bring international trade teams to South Dakota? What's the message you try to get across to them?
Well, we certainly try to, of course, first and foremost talk about the people, and that doesn't matter which state you're talking about in the wheat industry. It's all a reflection on the great farmers that make those crops possible. They believe in what they're growing. They have a sincere desire to produce the absolute best wheat they can. They want to have the same quality for their export market as they do for their own families. Beyond that, certainly we're looking strongly at that ever-growing focus upon sustainability, soil health, that ability to preserve that farm, to pass it down to those future generations.
So between your service in the Air Force and your decade of work for the South Dakota Wheat Commission, how many countries have you had the opportunity to visit?
I think I was counting just the other night. I think it's approaching 30.
Wow. And which ones in specific did you do through your course of activities with wheat?
The biggest ones, of course, we had some opportunity to approach conferences that might have been held on a worldwide basis, but true interaction with the producers, with the millers, with the buyers. Tremendous experience of going to Tanzania a few years ago as a part of a World Food Aid mission, and to see the opportunities for the humanitarian aid through sharing of crop. And then most recently, the opportunity to travel to Taiwan, South Korea, China, Japan to present the quality of the hard red winter crop to the millers and the bakers in that region.
You have the perspective of hindsight now. I know you haven't been retired that long, but moving forward, what would you like to see change in terms of U.S. policy towards the global wheat market? It's an ever fluid situation. I know that, but you've got a global perspective. What are What are your thoughts?
Well, regardless of what a good or great crop that we have in the wheat industry, we're still going to be largely influenced by the cost of transportation. And so as we look at the cost to move goods, whether it's rail into Mexico or whether it's being shipped all across the world, we still have to be able to compete with those countries that might be closer to the potential buyer and then have maybe a cheaper wheat to provide at the same time. So it's critical that we continue to kind of stay in our lane. That is to develop the highest milling quality wheat available, recognize that there is going to be a market for cheaper, poorer quality wheat, probably not where we want to play. But for that discerning customer that has a desire for strong milling quality wheat for the products that they want to make, that's where we've got to be, and we've got to develop a policy that allows us to play in that arena.
And the investment that wheat farmers in South Dakota are making through their checkoff, what do you think the future is of that? Where does the emphasis need to be for that investment? Well,
we continue to have to communicate what it's doing for them. At the end of the day, the producer sees only what they're selling that wheat for, and that's, of course, how many bushels did they produce. And then to a secondary effect, what's that protein level, and are they receiving par for the target protein? So we've got to address that. We continue to put the significant portion of our wheat checkoff funds in South Dakota back into research at South Dakota State University, looking at the agronomic features of both yield and then, of course, disease resistance.
What maybe surprised you in the 10 years you were working for South Dakota Wheat? I mean, you grew up on a farm, you have that agriculture experience. What about the industry maybe caught you off guard a little bit?
Just how complex it is. Certainly the ability as I get a chance to explain 6 classes of wheat to people that only understand that the wheat is in bread and what those different classes of wheat offer for characteristics and how they make such a wide diversity of products. So it's been fun to tell that story about the complexity of wheat, whether it's in a DNA, genetic standpoint, or whether it's the protein levels, or how it can be used in an end product.
Let's step aside from wheat here a little bit. I've got to ask you about your experience with the Boy Scouts. Seems like it's something you've been dedicated on for your whole life and something you'll be dabbling in with retirement, I imagine.
I am. I had the opportunity, of course, to join the Boy Scouts as a youth, was an Eagle Scout, and have been continuously registered with the Boy Scouts now for about 56 years. Do not see that ending in the near future. Provide a lot of tremendous volunteer service at the council level, and more recently probably at the national level. Be serving again for the 2026 National Scout Jamboree as the Chief of Logistics for the second time, and work a lot with the support of our councils. I serve as the chair for what's known as Council Service Territory 4, supporting the councils in the states of Montana, North Dakota, South Dakota, Minnesota, Wisconsin, Iowa.
So Chief of Logistics, that's not a small title for an event like that. I suppose there's a little bit of background in the Air Force that helps you out with that. What kind of, how big of a team do you have as Chief of Logistics for that type of event?
Well, I have a big team, fortunately, because we'll be servicing probably between 10 and 15,000 guests for 2 weeks, living in tents in mountains of West Virginia. And Chief of Logistics, of course, includes the food service, transportation, sanitation, maintenance of facilities. So fortunately, I've got a tremendous team, again, all volunteers who have already are signing up, again, 2 to 3 years early to spend a significant investment of registration fees, travel costs to go in and pay to volunteer for 2+ weeks.
Do you get a chance to take what you learned through the wheat industry and teach that to scouts?
Well, I do in kind of a bizarre way. One of the, of course, ever-increasing challenges in providing food service to nearly 15,000 people is the ever-increasing dietary restrictions and all of the diet choices and diet allergies and the complexities that have to be provided when dealing with those, along with religious accommodations accommodations.
Yeah, I imagine that's not a small challenge. So what's the plan going forward outside of Boy Scouts, Reid?
Well, certainly we'll continue to do that. As was mentioned in the introduction, I have spent quite a few years now also serving as a lay supply pastor within the Evangelical Lutheran Church of America, and enjoy the opportunity to assist small rural congregations as they transition perhaps between pastors or in a vacancy position. But also stepping into the role towards district governor for Lions Club International. But I hope to also spend some time restoring some antique farm equipment that's sitting in the machine shed, maybe do some blacksmithing. We want to do some travel for my wife and I and our family. So
doesn't sound like a lot of idle time for your retirement.
No, the idle time will unfortunately be today in the 100+ heat index mowing the yard of the farms.
Yeah, well, we have that as we're recording here in Kansas too, so we'll keep the same company. You've handed off the reins. Tell us about your successor at South Dakota.
Well, the successor is no stranger, certainly, to the wheat industry in South Dakota. Dr. Jonathan Kleinjohn has been serving as the extension crop agronomist for South Dakota State University. He's a Brookings County native. He also farms and raises wheat himself. So he is well known by the producers within the state and equally well respected. So he's going to step in very quickly. We had an opportunity for about a 5-month overlap to not teach him about wheat, but of course all of the other accounting, internal communications, legal requirements, etc. that go along with a commission.
Reid, you certainly have a continuing life of service, and we appreciate your service at every level. Any final message for your wheat farmer friends in South Dakota about what you think the future holds for them?
Well, I would just continue to encourage them to include wheat into that rotation. There are so many values that wheat brings to an operation, with hopefully price, but certainly with the increase of the quality of soil health, and return of desirable organic material, the breakup of herbicide resistance, to break up weed pressure, provide habitat for nesting pheasants, and the list goes on and on and on. So many facets of wheat, and we really think that there's a place for it in a strong rotation cropping system.
Reid, you got anything else you wanted to talk about?
No, just that it's been a pleasure to work with Kansas Wheat and all of the various agencies and the commissions and the states that are a part of the U.S. Wheat Associates. Over the last 10 years, the opportunity to meet so many producers, Kansas in particular, with the interface there, and working with IGP and working with the Kansas Wheat, working with the various organizations of Kansas State University, doing the wheat quality tour in Kansas. Just tremendous experiences. I thank those producers for the friendship and the opportunities I've had to get to know them, and I know that many of these friendships will continue into the future.
My thanks to Reid Christopherson for joining us on this episode of the Wheats on Your Mind podcast. If you have a follow-up question, just email us at kswheat@kswheat.com. I'm Aaron Harries. Thanks for listening.